At 4 o'clock in the morning on the 16th of August, 2025, a silence broken only by the rustle of wind along the borderlands gave way to a discovery that would shake not only a nation, but the whole continent. 57 trucks, seemingly ordinary, disguised as carriers of aid, were stopped in their tracks. Inside lay not food nor medicine, but an arsenal worth more than $700 million. Rifles, rockets, grenades, and enough bullets to drown a country in fire. Who sent these weapons? Who financed this mountain of death? And above all, who wanted to see Burkina Faso burn? At the center of this storm stood one man, Ibrahim Traore, the young president who chose to confront shadows older and darker than his nation's independence itself. He would not only intercept trucks, he would intercept a plot against the dignity of an entire continent. But this story is more than a headline. It is the cry of a people long targeted by hidden hands, and the proof that history has not ended, it has only turned a new page. Stay with us, because this is more than a news flash. It's about dignity, betrayal, and survival. Subscribe and join us for the Africa our ancestors dreamed of. The seizure of the trucks was only the spark. What came in the days that followed turned a midnight ambush into a battle for the soul of a nation. The drivers, shaken and confused, were taken into custody. Most insisted they knew nothing. They were told they were hauling farming equipment. Some even swore under oath they believed they were delivering aid. But as interrogations deepened, one name surfaced again and again: Marc-Antoine Zongo. Zongo was not the mastermind, but he was the first to crack. Pale, trembling, he admitted that he had been promised a generous sum for the journey. He thought he was transporting machinery, yet the secrecy, the back roads, the late-night schedule haunted him. Under the harsh light of the interrogation room, he finally whispered, "We were told to deliver the cargo to a warehouse in Togo. From there, it would be shipped abroad. I swear I did not know." His words opened the door to something much darker. Investigators quickly pieced together the puzzle. The trucks had originated from different towns, assembled deliberately only at the border to avoid detection. Each carried different paperwork, some stamped with forged humanitarian seals. The sophistication of the operation was undeniable. This was not the work of small-time smugglers. It required coordination, money, and above all, protection from powerful hands. Then came the breakthrough. A businessman known across Ouagadougou for his wealth and political connections was arrested, François Bongo. At first, he denied everything. He laughed at the accusations, called them political theater. But the pressure mounted. Documents seized from his office showed bank transfers linked to accounts in the Gulf. His phone contained encrypted messages to foreign contacts. After days of silence, his resistance collapsed. Barely able to speak, Bongo confessed. His words fell like thunder across the nation. This was no smuggling. This was preparation for a coup. We had meetings in Accra. In Abidjan, we were told the weapons would fuel unrest. The chaos would justify a military intervention. Foreign powers promised us support. Paris was involved. Washington gave the green light. The room fell silent. Generals stared at each other in disbelief. Ministers clenched their fists. President Ibrahim Traore leaned forward and asked the only question that mattered. Which foreign powers? Bongo's lips trembled. He listed names, envoys, intermediaries, officials. Some carried diplomatic passports. Some worked for multinational corporations. Others, shockingly, were men who once sat in the very government they now sought to overthrow. He revealed the name of the operation: Restored Democracy, its budget $700 million. And the 57 trucks were only phase one. Terror attacks were to be staged. Opposition groups mobilized. Traitors within the army activated. Within weeks, the country would be engulfed in fire. When Traore announced this confession to his council, fury swept through the room. General Sadu, Minister of Defense, slammed his hand on the table. With this arsenal, they could have enslaved the nation. Interior, Minister Hussein Karour spoke with grim clarity. If these weapons had reached their hands, Burkina Faso would already be burning. we would be fighting our own brothers in the streets. But the betrayal cut deeper than politics. In the capital, when news of the confession leaked, citizens filled the streets. Mothers clutched their children tighter, elders shook their heads in sorrow, and young men shouted with rage. "How long will outsiders treat Africa as their chessboard?" they cried. The anger was not only at the conspirators, but also at the invisible hands pulling the strings from abroad. The government wasted no time. Operation Storm was launched at dawn. In a sweeping move, security forces raided 23 warehouses and compounds across Ouagadougou. 17 were found to be stockpiled with weapons, cash, and documents. Arrested among the shadows were retired generals, former ministers, wealthy businessmen, and even individuals carrying foreign diplomatic passports. Their crime was treason, their punishment certain. The press conference that followed was unlike any the world had seen. President Traore stood before mountains of seized rifles, rockets stacked high like firewood, crates of ammunition spilling open for all cameras to witness. Behind him, rows of soldiers stood silent but resolute. He began not as a politician, but as a sentinel of history. 3 days ago, we intercepted the largest arms smuggling operation in our nation's history. But this was no smuggling. It was a plan to destroy Burkina Faso, to fracture Africa, and to enslave us to foreign powers. Look at these weapons. This is what they had prepared for us, our deaths, our chaos, our submission. Questions erupted from the global press. CNN asked, which nations are behind this? BBC demanded, who are the masterminds? Al Jazeera queried, what does this mean for Africa's stability? Traore's answers were measured but unyielding. The investigation is ongoing, but already 17 conspirators have been arrested. Weapons traced to NATO countries are in our hands. Informants are speaking. The full truth will be revealed. This was not just an attack on Burkina Faso. This was an attack on Africa. As the cameras rolled, Traore's words echoed beyond the room, beyond the borders. Across oceans, Western governments bristled. Diplomats whispered of sanctions. Yet in Africa, in the streets of Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Niamey, in Conakry, the people cheered. For them, this was more than politics, it was vindication, proof that the invisible war they had long suspected was now laid bare before the world. But with every revelation, a darker truth loomed larger. If such powerful nations were willing to bankroll coups, to disguise rifles as sacks of grain, to bribe ministers and generals, then what lay ahead for a small country daring to resist? If foreign fingerprints were already visible on these weapons, then whose hand was reaching for the trigger? The night of the 16th of August was like any other along the southern edge of the Sahel. Quiet, the air still, the roads almost deserted. But on that night, just past midnight, a convoy began moving in the shadows. 57 trucks, each heavy with a secret, rolled slowly along back roads near Canary, close to the Togo border. For years, this route had been used by smugglers carrying small loads of fuel, contraband cigarettes, and sometimes food supplies. But nothing of this magnitude had ever been seen before. Captain Moussa Kabore, the commander of the local border unit, had grown up in these lands. He knew when silence was natural and when silence meant danger. Through the thin radio static came his urgent words, "Something is wrong. Too many trucks. Too late at night." He ordered his men to hold position but kept his eyes on the horizon. By 1 o'clock in the morning, he had reported the anomaly to Ouagadougou. Within minutes, the information reached the presidential palace. President Ibrahim Traore, alerted in the middle of the night, did not dismiss the report as routine. He had been briefed for months about attempts to destabilize the nation. Weapons had been trickling across borders from Libya and Sudan. Yet this was something else. Without hesitation, he summoned General Ibrahim Zerbo, commander of the Special Forces. His order was simple but carried the weight of the nation's survival. Intercept the convoy, secure the cargo. But be cautious, we may be facing more than smugglers. By 2 o'clock, drones were launched from a hidden base, their infrared cameras painting the black roads with glowing dots. From the air, the convoy looked endless, a steel snake winding through darkness. Helicopters hovered at a distance, tracking every turn. Ground units set up a covert roadblock at a choke point where a narrow stretch forced the trucks into single file. Special forces fanned out, lying in the scrub with rifles ready, waiting for the signal. The tension grew unbearable as the trucks approached. At precisely 4 o'clock in the morning, the trap snapped shut. Armored vehicles roared onto the road, blocking the path forward. Lights flashed. The lead truck screeched to a halt, while others tried to reverse, engines screaming in the night. But within minutes, the drivers were surrounded, hands raised, eyes wide with shock. The first truck was pried open. Soldiers expected food sacks or machine parts. Instead, beneath carefully arranged bags of grain lay crates heavy, cold, unmistakable. When the lid was lifted, the sight stole the breath of even the most seasoned fighter. AK-47 assault rifles, stacked in neat rows, gleamed in the dim light. Another box revealed M16 rifles. A third was packed with grenades. By the time the inspection reached the 10th truck, the truth was undeniable. Every single vehicle was a warehouse of death. Captain Kabore's voice trembled as he reported directly to the president. "Mr. President, you will not believe this. Each truck is filled with weapons, enough to arm an entire division." The radio carried a silence before Traore's voice returned, firm and measured. "Do not lose a single bullet. Secure the drivers. Make them talk. Someone is preparing for war against Burkina Faso." As dawn crept across the horizon, the scale of the seizure became clear. 25,000 AK-47 rifles, 10,000 M16 rifles, 13 million rounds of ammunition, 70,000 hand grenades, 2,500 rocket launchers, 400 anti-aircraft missiles, 50 tons of explosives. A figure so vast that even the generals who had seen years of conflict were left speechless. General Zerbo muttered grimly to his men, "With this firepower, you could invade a country." Interior Minister Hussein Karour, briefed shortly after, added, "If these weapons had slipped through, we would already be facing chaos in our streets. Terror groups would rise overnight. The army itself could fracture. A coup could begin before sunrise." But the mystery deepened. With every truck inspected, the crates were marked with faint serial numbers. Some had been filed off, but intelligence officers recovered fragments. By the end of the first day, forensic experts had traced the weapons to 3 sources: leftovers from the Libyan civil war, rifles smuggled from Yemen, and brand new arms straight from European factories, never used once. The total estimated value surpassed $700 million. The question became inescapable. Who had the resources to fund such a massive operation? Who dared to gamble with the fate of a nation and perhaps of an entire continent? This was no ordinary smuggling run. It was a deliberate plan, carefully engineered, meant to plunge the heart of West Africa into flames. And yet, this was only the beginning. If this was the cargo they caught, what unimaginable schemes lay hidden in the ones that slipped through? For days after the seizure, the air in Ouagadougou felt heavier. The sun still rose over the red earth. Children still played in the dusty streets, but everyone carried the weight of a single question. What if those trucks had not been stopped? The answer was terrifying. Defense Minister General Sadu admitted in private, "With this arsenal, the country could have been torn apart in weeks. Neighbor fought neighbor. Soldiers turned on their commanders. A civil war worse than Libya's." It was not just speculation. The documents recovered from François Bongo's office laid out the playbook. Staged terrorist attacks in crowded markets, assassinations of key figures, fake calls for foreign peacekeepers. Each step designed to shatter confidence in the state, to plunge the people into fear so deep that they would welcome a puppet government promising order. Economists later calculated the price of such chaos. $700 million in weapons could have crippled the fragile economy of Burkina Faso overnight. Trade routes would collapse, agriculture would wither, families would flee into neighboring countries as refugees. Hospitals, already stretched thin, would overflow with casualties. The state treasury would bleed dry, not to build schools or clinics, but to fund endless battles in city streets. Ordinary citizens, hearing these details, reacted with a mixture of rage and grief. An elderly woman selling mangoes near Independence Square shook her head, tears in her eyes. They wanted to make us another Syria, another Yemen. But we are not for sale. Young men gathered in cafes, voices rising as they debated. How many of our leaders are still loyal? How many sit at the table of foreigners? The sense of betrayal ran deep, but so did a newfound determination. Inside the government, the consequences were equally profound. Traitors had been unmasked, retired generals who once swore oaths to protect the flag, ministers who once paraded as patriots. Their arrests left gaping wounds in the nation's political fabric. Trust was broken. Every institution was now under scrutiny. Yet at the same time, the crisis forged unexpected unity. For the first time in decades, rival political factions spoke with one voice: Burkina Faso must survive. Internationally, the implications rippled outward. ECOWAS, long seen as an instrument of external influence, faced open skepticism. In Bamako, in Niamey, in Conakry, leaders pointed to Ouagadougou and declared, "This is proof." Africa is under attack not by its people, but by those who fear Africa's independence. The coup plotters had failed, but their failure had awakened an entire region. The cultural consequences were no less striking. Across radio waves, griots, the traditional storytellers, began composing songs of resistance, weaving the story of how President Ibrahim Traore had outwitted the shadows. In marketplaces, women spoke his name with reverence. In classrooms, teachers told their pupils, "Remember this day. Remember that unity saved us." What might have been the darkest chapter in Burkina Faso's history was instead becoming a lesson in vigilance. Yet beneath the pride lay unease. Security forces reported sporadic clashes in the north, whispers of armed cells still waiting for orders. Intelligence services warned that money was still flowing into the country, that not every conspirator had been captured. The people celebrated, but they also looked over their shoulders. The coup had failed, yes, but its embers still smoldered. For President Traore, the political consequences were paradoxical. On one hand, his popularity soared. Crowds chanted his name, calling him the guardian of the nation. On the other, the burden of leadership grew heavier. Every move he made would now be judged not only by his citizens, but also by the world. Would he use this crisis to strengthen democracy, or would he consolidate power to guard against future threats? Supporters saw him as Sankara's heir. Critics worried that vigilance could slide into authoritarianism. Still, one truth stood clear. The attempted coup had failed to break the nation. Instead, it had ignited a new spirit. A taxi driver summed it up simply: "They wanted us to fear, but now we are awake." And yet, questions lingered. If Burkina Faso had been the target, how long before Mali, Niger, or Guinea faced the same fire? Could Africa truly shield itself from forces with pockets so deep and reach so far? Do you believe this was Africa's long-awaited awakening? Share your voice in the comments below, because silence has never saved a people. The coup had failed, but the storm had only shifted. The question was no longer if, but when, the next wave would strike. When President Ibrahim Traore revealed the confessions of François Bongo and displayed the mountains of seized weapons, the shock did not stop at Burkina Faso's borders. It reverberated across continents. Overnight, the story moved from a national crisis to a global confrontation. Western governments reacted first. Paris, accused directly of involvement, denied all charges, but demanded the release of French citizens detained in Ouagadougou. Washington issued a cautious statement, calling for due process and warning of potential consequences should American nationals be harmed. Diplomats quietly pressured Burkina Faso to hand over those with foreign passports, hinting at economic sanctions. The irony was not lost on the people. The same nations accused of sponsoring the plot were now demanding leniency for their captured operatives. Meanwhile, other powers seized the moment. Moscow was quick to declare its support. President Traore acted within his right to defend national sovereignty, Russian state media announced. China went further, offering to donate surveillance equipment and border technology. Africa's security is the foundation of Africa's prosperity, their ambassador declared. Turkey echoed the sentiment, calling arms smuggling a crime against humanity. Iran condemned what it called imperialist aggression, while Venezuela's Nicolás Maduro hailed Traore as a modern Simon Bolivar, standing against empire. The African Union found itself caught between caution and admiration. Official communiques called for restraint and dialogue, but in private many leaders applauded Traore's defiance. In Mali, Niger, and Guinea, governments under military rule voiced open solidarity, warning that the same conspiracy could easily have targeted them. Across the Sahel, the seizure was no longer just about weapons. It was proof of a wider battle for independence in the 21st century. In Western capitals, analysts debated the implications. If Traore's accusations were true, then NATO countries had risked global scandal to manipulate African politics. If false, then Burkina Faso had just declared a propaganda war against the West. But in Ouagadougou, there was little doubt. The weapons had serial numbers, the suspects had confessed, and the people had seen the arsenal with their own eyes. The deeper question was strategic. Why Burkina Faso, and why now? Some argued that the country's withdrawal from French influence, its growing ties to Russia, and its vocal criticism of Western policies had made it a target. Others pointed to the gold and uranium under Burkinabe soil resources foreign companies coveted. Whatever the motive, the seizure made one fact clear. Africa was no longer just a backdrop in global politics. It was a battlefield where great powers tested their influence. President Traore framed it bluntly during his press conference. This was not only an attack on Burkina Faso, it was an attack on Africa. The masks are off. Those who wish to recolonize must understand, we are awake. His words were replayed across African television, shared on social media, and quoted in newspapers from Lagos to Nairobi. Yet the clash was far from over. Western embassies hardened their stance, hinting at sanctions. African allies spoke of solidarity but feared the economic backlash. Russia and China saw opportunities, but their support came with interests of their own. And so, caught between old empires and new patrons, Africa faced a haunting question: would this moment mark the continent's rebirth, or another round of dependency under different masters? The seizure of 57 trucks was more than a victory for Burkina Faso. It was a crossroads for the entire continent. The conspirators had failed, but the choices Africa faced were only beginning to unfold. One path was fraught with danger. Western governments, embarrassed by the revelations, could tighten the screws with sanctions. Aid packages might be withdrawn, trade restricted, and financial institutions pressed to isolate the country. For a landlocked nation already struggling with poverty, such pressure could bite hard. There was also the risk of further covert plots, smaller and more subtle, designed to destabilize from within. Enemies denied today might return tomorrow, with sharper tools and deeper pockets. But another path offered opportunity. By exposing the conspiracy so publicly, President Traore had given Africa something rare, proof that vigilance could triumph. His call to melt weapons into school bells, to turn grenades into irrigation canals, was more than symbolism. It was a blueprint for a different kind of power, one rooted not in foreign dependency, but in self-reliance. If Burkina Faso could transform crisis into renewal, other nations might follow. Already the streets of Ouagadougou echoed with chants not just of loyalty to Traore, but of a wider dream. "Africa, rise!" shouted the youth, their voices blending with the drums of traditional griots. For the older generation, those who had lived through colonial rule and its aftermath, the moment stirred memories of Thomas Sankara, of Patrice Lumumba, of leaders who once dared to dream of a continent free from external chains. Many whispered that history was giving them a second chance. Regional alliances, too, began to shift. Mali, Niger, and Guinea, nations facing their own struggles with foreign influence, looked to Burkina Faso as a symbol of defiance. Conversations started about a Sahel alliance, not only military but economic, built on mutual protection and shared resources. Such unity, if realized, could reshape West Africa's destiny. Yet unity came with challenges. Could nations scarred by poverty and conflict truly resist the temptations of foreign money? Could leaders hold firm against bribes and promises of power? And most importantly, could ordinary Africans believe long enough in themselves to resist the despair that centuries of interference had sown? As the dust settled, President Traore addressed his people once again. We are not condemned to repeat the tragedies of Libya, Syria, or Yemen. Our choice is clear: either we fight for dignity or we surrender it. Either we build for our children or we bury them with weapons not of their making. His words resonated with grandparents who remembered colonial schools, with mothers who longed for hospitals, with farmers who prayed for irrigation canals instead of bullets. The future was uncertain, but one truth was undeniable. The seizure had changed the narrative. Africa was no longer only a victim of global games, it was an actor, capable of seizing its destiny. And so the world watched, holding its breath, as Africa stood at the edge of a new dawn. But would the continent step forward into its own future, or be dragged back into the shadows once more? In the span of 1 week, Burkina Faso moved from the brink of chaos to the threshold of history. What began as a midnight interception of trucks became a symbol of resistance, of resilience, and of rebirth. The plotters had hoped to drown the nation in blood, to turn brothers into enemies, and to install puppets answering not to their people, but to distant capitals. Instead, their plan was shattered, their weapons seized, their secrets exposed before the world. For President Ibrahim Traore, the victory was not just military, it was moral. He proved that vigilance could outmatch deception, that courage could silence betrayal. His vow to melt the weapons into schools, clinics, and canals transformed an arsenal of death into a promise of life. And for the people, it was not merely about surviving a coup. It was about reclaiming dignity long denied, about telling the world that Burkina Faso would no longer bow. Yet the story does not end in Ouagadougou. Across Africa, the shock waves continue. Elders whisper Sankara's name with renewed pride. Youth chant, "Africa rise," in the streets. Leaders from Mali to Guinea see a shared destiny in this struggle. The weapons seized may one day rust away, but the spirit awakened cannot be buried. Still, the challenge remains. Will Africa use this moment to build unity, to forge alliances beyond the reach of manipulation? Or will the continent fall once again into the traps of division and dependency? The answer lies not only in presidents and generals, but in the millions of ordinary voices that must choose dignity over despair. If this story stirs your chest, do not let it fade into silence. Like, share, and subscribe, because for too long, Africa's history was written by others. Now together, we can speak its future out loud. In the end, the miracle was not simply the seizure of 57 trucks. It was the winning of 57 million hearts. Hearts now beating for freedom, for justice, for Africa's awakening. And as long as they continue to beat, no empire, no conspiracy, no shadow can ever silence them again.